It's what the data science initiative, part of the data science initiative's aspirations is to really look not just at the technical aspects of what data science can and cannot do, but also look at the societal impacts. I think that's very, very important. As Trisha said, there's a lot of good things that data science can do, but it can also enforce a lot of biases, unfairness, and non-transparent decisions that being made using data. And so I think what this panel today is going to explore is this interface between the societal impact and data science. So I would like to introduce our panelists. I'm really excited to have a great group of panelists here. Our first speaker will be Meredith Broussard. She's an assistant professor at the Arthur Carter Journalism Institute at NYU. She's also the 2018 Reynolds Journalism Institute Fellow and the author of Artificial Unintelligence, How Computers Misunderstand the World. Her research focuses on artificial intelligence and investigative reporting. After her, Milner will speak. Milner is the co-founder and executive director of Data for Black Lives. She began organizing against the school-to-prison pipeline at Power Center for Social Change as a high school senior in Miami. She has a BA from Brown University, as Trisha mentioned, and serves on the board of the Highlander Center in Tennessee. So next will be Virginia Eubanks, who is an associate professor of political science at the University at Albany, SUNY. She's the author of Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor, and Digital Dead End, Fighting for Social Justice in the Information Age. And for 2 decades, she has worked in community technology and economic justice movements. Sinyangwe is a policy analyst and a data scientist who co-founded We the Protesters to end police violence and systemic racism in America. Sam supports movement activists across the country to collect and use data as a tool for fighting police violence through mapping police violence and to advance policy solutions to this issue through Campaign Zero. And last but not least, Max Clermont will speak. He's the co-founder and head of policy at Data for Black Lives. Previously, he served as chief of staff at the University of Chicago Medicine's Trauma Center and as project manager with 270 Strategies, which is a political and public engagement consulting company in Chicago. Max holds a BA and Master's in Public Health from Brown University. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And so the format will be that each of our panelists will speak for between 15 and 20 minutes. And so we will hold our questions until the very end. When they're all through, they will come up to the podium, and then we can have a question and answer session with all of you. So then Trisha and I will sort of moderate that. And so then we welcome any questions that you have, any comments that you might have to the presentations that you see. And so I would like to welcome Meredith, who will be our first speaker.
Hi, everybody. I'm really happy to be here tonight. I'm going to talk today about artificial intelligence, what it is and what it isn't, and what this has to do with race and ethnicity. So I want you to think about artificial intelligence for a second and think about what comes into your head. So we're going to come back to that in 1 second. I want to come to this conversation about social justice and about data as a data journalist. So I'm a data journalism professor at NYU. I started my career as a computer scientist, and then I quit to become a journalist, and now I do data journalism, which is the practice of finding stories in numbers and using numbers to tell stories. And as a storyteller, I got really interested in the concept of artificial intelligence, but also in the stories we tell ourselves about artificial intelligence. So you were thinking about AI in your head. Think about an image that came up. And was it one of these? Because this is not artificial intelligence. And neither is this, all right? Although it would be really cool if that were real AI. And this is also not artificial intelligence. So Hollywood has a lot to do with what we imagine about artificial intelligence, but the reality is very different. So the reality is that artificial intelligence is a branch of computer science, the same way that algebra is a branch of mathematics. And inside artificial intelligence, there are lots of other subfields. There are subfields like expert systems, like machine learning, like natural language processing. But machine learning is the one that's really popular right now. And so there's been this linguistic confusion where when people say artificial intelligence in terms of, oh, we're using AI for our business, what they actually mean is machine learning. Okay. Machine learning sounds like there's a little brain inside the computer. And there is not. Machine learning is just math, even though it sounds like it's something much fancier than that. And sometimes people are disappointed when I say this. They're like, oh, really? Like, there's not a little, like, sentient being inside the computer? And I say, no, I'm sorry, but we can be excited about the possibilities otherwise. So one of the ways that computer scientists think about this is we think about narrow and general AI. General AI is all of the Hollywood stuff. So that is the killer robots, that's the machines that make paper clips and drown out humanity, that's the singularity, that's the stuff in the movies. It's all totally imaginary. Narrow AI is what's real, and narrow AI is just math. Okay, so we need these formal classifications so that we can go on and talk about artificial intelligence, we can talk about data and what we do with data without bringing in the Hollywood stuff, because the Hollywood stuff is really fun to talk about and really interesting, but it's not real and it's not affecting people's lives the way that big data systems are being used to increase inequality in the world today. And so I also want to talk about a concept that I read about in my book called techno-chauvinism. Techno-chauvinism is the perspective that technology is always the superior solution in every situation. And it's the perspective that technological solutions are better than human solutions, and in fact that technology is better than people. So it's techno-chauvinism when people say, oh, kids don't need books in schools anymore. We're just going to take all the textbooks and we're going to replace them with iPads because iPads are better than books. Now, I would argue that we should ask, what is the right tool for the task? Because sometimes the appropriate tool is a printed book in the hands of a child. And sometimes the appropriate tool is an iPad, and it's not a competition. Both are valid in different situations. So we should ask, what is the right tool for the task? But techno-chauvinism says, no, the technology is always superior. It says technology is better than people. And I want to talk a little bit about who says this. Who has given us this cultural idea that technological solutions are superior to all other solutions? Well, a lot of it is due to math, to the discipline of math. And there are lots of wonderful mathematicians out there, but there's this ideology inside the world of elite math that says that math is better than other things. Mathematicians can sometimes be snobs. My apologies to the mathematicians out there, but so we have this idea that math is better than people, and then we actually have this in mathematical history. So mathematicians have a genealogy. So when you are a student of somebody, you become part of their mathematical genealogy. And I'm sure many of you saw the article in the New York Times this week about what it's like to be the only black mathematician. There are issues around racial and gender bias inside math, and these are the issues that the tech world has inherited. So let's go back to Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz, the inventor of the step reckoner, which is the ancestor of the computer. And Leibniz said, "It is beneath the dignity of excellent men to waste their time in calculation when any peasant could do the work just as accurately with the aid of a machine." So there's this idea that computing is beneath the labor or beneath the dignity of excellent men. And the computer is the machine that does this undignified work. Right? Let's layer in some more social concerns. let's think about who is telling us, who is inheriting these ideas about the superiority of mathematical men, the fact that the machines are subservient to the mathematical mind. And then let's look at how those ideas have been incorporated into current ideas about technology and society and current ideas about techno-chauvinism. Right? So actually, most of our ideas about technology and society and about the appropriate role of technology in society actually comes from a very small and homogeneous group of people. So up here, we've got pictures of Claude Shannon, right here, who's the father of information theory. Here we've got Alan Turing. You all know who Alan Turing is. We've got Marvin Minsky, who's considered the father of artificial intelligence. We've got John von Neumann, who is the inventor of the underlying computer architecture of every computer ever. And then we've got Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the founders of Google. And so what do these folks all have in common? Say it out loud. They're all white men. What else? Anybody know anything about their backgrounds? All right, I heard math over there. Okay, so they're all mathematicians. They're mostly Ivy League. Sometimes we could say they all have short hair. I don't know if that matters. All right, so there is nothing wrong with being a white male Ivy League mathematician because, in fact, some of my best friends are Ivy League male mathematicians, and they're great. But the problem is that very homogeneous groups of people are not. The problem is that people embed their own biases in technology. And so when we have a very small and homogeneous group of people telling us what the future of technology and society is, we get those folks' unconscious biases embedded in the technology. Now, I am not saying that computer scientists or programmers are going out and making technology that is intentionally racist, because I could not get up in the morning if I believed that. Everybody is out there doing their best, but we all have unconscious biases, and that's what we embed in the technology that we create. So when we have diverse groups of people creating technology, we can create technology that is better for a greater number of people. But we don't have that right now. We have very small, homogeneous groups of people creating technology, and we have a lot of problems that have resulted. So, for example, let's look at the machine bias investigation by ProPublica. This is an investigation by some data journalists where they looked at the COMPAS algorithm. You've all heard of the COMPAS algorithm? Okay, so mathematically, there is no way for the COMPAS algorithm to be fair to black defendants and to white defendants. If the COMPAS algorithm is used to rate you after you have been arrested and rate your recidivism score, there is no mathematical way for it to be fair. The inequality of the real world is embedded in the data that is used for this algorithm. Another example was surfaced by Sophia Noble in her book, Algorithms of Oppression. And Sophia Noble noticed that when you Google white girls, you get images of girls, and when you Google black girls, you get porn. So there is inequality, there is racism embedded in the very algorithm that we are relying on for search for information to tell us about the world. Another example was found by LaTanya Sweeney, a professor at Harvard, who discovered that when you Google black-sounding names, you get links to things like bail bonds. And when you Google white-sounding names, you get ordinary links. And she put in the name of Ebony Glover PhD, who has a BA from Spelman, an MA from Emory, a PhD in neuroscience from Emory, a very accomplished woman. And the ad that came up first was Ebony Glover arrested. And then we have the racist soap dispenser. This is a viral video where a white man puts his hand under the soap dispenser and it works, and then a black man puts his hand under the soap dispenser and it does not work. But then he takes a white paper towel and puts it under the soap dispenser and it works. Okay? So these are the kinds of problems that result when we don't have diverse groups of people making technology, but they're also problems that the makers of the technology need to care about. They need to care enough to solve these problems, to be proactive about these problems, to make sure that these problems do not get into the technology in the first place. Another example is the Gender Shades project. Are you familiar with this one? This is very much in the news right now. This is a project by Joy Buolamwini, who is a student at MIT, and she tested the major facial recognition algorithms and found that they have the same problems as the racist soap dispenser. They don't recognize dark faces as well as they recognize light faces. They don't recognize women as well as they recognize men, and they consistently misgender people. Again, it's a result of not having sufficiently diverse teams, but also folks not caring that social problems are embedded in these computational systems. And to go back to techno-chauvinism, it's privileging the technical solution over the social one. We've also got a concept called positive asymmetry, which is something that happens in groups, which means that if you're the person in the group who notices that the algorithm is being racist, you're probably not going to bring it up because you don't want to be the outlier. You don't want to be the troublemaker. You want to go along with the group. And this is a facet of group dynamics. It's a known issue, but it explains a little bit about why it's so hard to talk about these things, why it's so hard to talk about these things in Silicon Valley, why it's so hard to be the person in the room who speaks up and says, no, this is not just about formulas, this is about people's lives. So what can we do? We have all these things that are wrong. What can we do to help? How can we solve the problem? Well, the first thing you can do is buy my book. Because I talk about all these things, and I talk about what is artificial intelligence, and I talk about what is machine learning. And another thing you can do is you can check out all of the great resources that are out there for resisting techno-chauvinism, for learning more, and for getting involved. So let's take a look at a few of them. Data for Black Lives. We're so fortunate to have a couple of Data for Black Lives founders here today. Their conference is amazing, and you should check out everything that is happening around the Data for Black Lives community. A couple of books I would recommend. Virginia Eubanks' book, Automating Inequality. Kathy O'Neill's book, Weapons of Math Destruction. There's a book called Technically Wrong by Sarah Wachter-Botner, whose name, unfortunately, I mess up sometimes. There are other groups. There's Black in AI. There's Data and Society. There's AI Now, both think tanks who are working on algorithmic accountability and artificial intelligence and justice issues. So there's lots to be done. We have far to go, but we are moving along the path, I hope, because if we build AI systems that are based on the data in the world right now as it is, we're never going to get to the world as it should be. And I want to see the world as it should be. Thank you.
Great. Awesome. Well, I don't have any slides. Can we get like some more light up here in front of the house? Okay, awesome. Thank you, Meredith. Yeah, I just wanted to thank Professor Rose, Professor Sandsted, and the Center for Race and Ethnicity in America, as well as the amazing Brown Data Science Initiative. Thanks to my wonderful esteemed panelists who I've had the honor to get to know in person and also through their incredible work. Speaking here at Brown feels a lot like coming home. It was right here on this campus where my vision for Data for Black Lives began to take form. Data for Black Lives is a movement of scientists and activists committed to harnessing the power of data and technology to make real change in the lives of Black people. Data for Black Lives was born out of a desire to transform the role that data and technology play in society. Today, I will share the story of how we began, my story. I learned to collect, analyze, and use data as a high school student because early on I realized that alone we could be ignored, but that there was power in a number. When students at a neighboring high school organized a peaceful protest after a school administrator put a ninth grader in a headlock, it made national news, but not in the way that it would have today. I'll never forget seeing the footage of SWAT team units flooding the school, of police shoving the small frames of students I grew up with against police cars. On CNN and local news, the headlines read, "Riot at Miami Edison Senior High School." I knew that unless we found new ways to be heard, to disrupt the narratives that facilitated this level of abuse, my future and the future of many other young people would continue to be at stake. When we were turned away from public hearings, we surveyed 600 students about their experiences in schools, and we shared the findings in a comic book. For many of the young people we surveyed, this was their first time ever even being asked about experiences in their schools, and at that moment, they realized that they weren't bad kids because they had been suspended for forgetting their ID at home or wearing the wrong color t-shirt under their uniform, but that this was a statewide problem, it was a national problem, and it was known as the school-to-prison pipeline. Survey collection was a microphone, a way to provide data that reflected the disparate impact of suspensions and arrests happening in our schools. Data was collective action and accountability for the horrific human rights and civil rights abuses that had been allowed to occur for far too long. I came to Brown with a clear motivation: to gain new skills in data science and research methods to amplify the voice of people who had long been silenced. And I did that with a vigor, driven by my insatiable intellectual curiosity and motivated by the urgent life or death conditions faced by people in my own community. I found mentorship in Brown faculty, such as my advisor, Glenn Lowry. Our political views may not have always been congruent, steel sharpens steel, but his classes were essential to deepening my understanding of the power of data and its role in reinforcing inequality, the ways in which data was destiny, from his work on poverty and the creation of the American underclass to exposure to the most cutting-edge findings on the long-term impact of criminal records and the social impact of data regimes, such as the seminal work of scholars like the late Diva Pager. I remember taking Trisha Rose's African American Life in the City, learning about the Great Black Migration and the history of data-driven enterprises like redlining, the basis for the current use of zip codes as a proxy for race in car insurance algorithms, risk assessments, credit scores, amongst other automated decision-making processes that reinforce the aggressive public policy agendas of the past. Because in the age of big data, unless we are aware of this history, unless we know this history, we risk repeating it. Brown's open curriculum was licensed for me to break the molds of disciplines, to destroy silos created by the academy, and to create a roadmap for the interdisciplinary multiracial movement known as Data for Black Lives. Everything I was learning put a battery in my back, as I like to say. I found an intellectual home in the Department of Africana Studies, which trained me to turn a critical eye to all forms of knowledge production. I took a vast majority of my classes in the econ department and was often the only undergrad in graduate level qualitative and quantitative methods courses in the Urban Education Policy Program and what is now the School of Public Health. Well, congrats on that accreditation, by the way, much, much deserved. My friend Lucas Mason Brown and I, who would go on to help me launch Data for Black Lives as a 501c3, had even organized an independent study called Radical Equations, based on the book by our now good friend, civil rights leader, and founder of the Algebra Project, Bob Moses. The aim of this course was to explore the ways in which math and science were used during the civil rights movement. And sadly, we were unable to find a faculty sponsor, a struggle that I know some of the students in here have also experienced and can understand. But I say, don't give up. My own life became an important text, validating my experiences and showing me the power of our own stories, our own lived experiences, as one of the most potent forms of data in our arsenal. I returned to Miami that summer with a renewed sense of purpose and an arsenal of skills in data collection and research that was urgently needed there. I was asked to lead a reproductive justice campaign to address the Black infant mortality crisis in Miami. And although the national infant mortality rate had decreased steadily over the past 50 years, the Black infant mortality rate had remained constant. Mothers in the community knew that this tragedy was connected to hospital practices such as the aggressive marketing of infant formula and the overuse of unnecessary cesarean section operations. But without data, community outcry was ignored. With a small team of moms, I surveyed 300 mothers on their experiences in Jackson Hospital, our public hospital, and the largest public hospital in the country. We weren't able to bring 300 mothers into the boardroom when we met with the hospital finally, but the hospital CEO could not deny the data that we collected. A campaign that would have taken years to win was accomplished within months. And today, the lives of hundreds of thousands of mothers and babies have been impacted by the changes in hospital practices we fought for. None of this would have been possible without my training as a researcher and social scientist and a collaboration with a team of data scientists at Loyola Marymount University. A year after this victory, around the same time, some of us in Miami had to occupy the Florida state capitol after George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin's murderer, was acquitted. I was able to witness a milestone in the work that began with the comic book that I mentioned earlier. By then, I learned that our comic book was being used all over the country by other groups working to end the school-to-prison pipeline in cities like Oakland, New Orleans, Denver, Knoxville, Tennessee. After years of fighting for restorative justice, the nation and our school district finally caught up. The Obama administration had adopted language around the school-to-prison pipeline, and mainstream media outlets were reporting on the need for restorative justice as an alternative to the overly punitive justice system. In 2014, the Office of Civil Rights released disaggregated data on suspensions and arrests in schools. And until then, the data that we had collected on our own was the only of its kind. We were able to use this data to show the impact of the school-to-prison pipeline disaggregated by school, further revealing the discrepancies between what happened at predominantly Black and Latino schools that serve low-income students and the very, very different policies at public schools that served wealthy white students. That school year, the district committed to fully funding restorative justice practices in all schools in Miami-Dade County. I was sold on the power of data and its possibilities. But I also knew that the reality for most Black communities were very different. Artificial intelligence, as Meredith just mentioned, was being used to militarize schoolyards and borders alike. Recidivism algorithms were perpetuating racism without racist. But I thought, what would it look like to take this model of connecting scientists and activists, my own experiences, and bring it to scale? I knew so many people who wanted to be involved in the movement for racial justice. People like my co-founder, Lucas, who's white, who was halfway through his PhD at MIT. Lucas was passionate about mathematics, but when he saw the thing that he loved the most transformed into a weapon to harm and oppress groups of people in this country, he felt he had no choice but to do something. I also knew so many incredible, effective leaders from all over the country that I'd met in my time as an organizer, that with a little bit of data capacity would be able to shift power and will win real, concrete, and measurable change in the lives of Black people in their community, and all people. The idea was simple but ambitious: to equip organizers around the country with the data tools and expertise needed to protect Black communities, to build a network of scientists and activists to solve real problems in the lives of Black people. In August of 2016, Lucas, Max, who you'll hear from as well, and I began planning our inaugural conference, and in the process, we realized that we'd hit a zeitgeist. Just saying the words, data for Black lives, unleashed the imaginations of so many people. From our very first roundtable meeting with community leaders to pitch our idea, to the halls of MIT as we garnered the support and enthusiasm of faculty and administrators, every day data for Black lives grew. Movement building is not the most high-tech solution, but I believe that it works. 3 years and 2 sold-out conferences later, we've been able to build a network of over 4,000 scientists and activists. Data for Black Lives has been able to accomplish what I wanted it to accomplish, to create a new narrative, to transform the role that data plays in public life on a local and national level. Last year, we were in the process of supporting the work of a coalition of organizers, educators, and activists in St. Paul, Minnesota, who are fighting a data sharing agreement proposed to happen between the school district, Ramsey County Sheriff's Office, and child welfare agencies, to create risk ratios for at-risk students, what the coalition aptly named the cradle to prison algorithm. Just a week ago, because of their organizing and because of the work that they've done, it was announced that this joint powers agreement would be dissolved. In the wake of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, I wrote an open letter to Facebook on behalf of the Data for Black Lives movement that demanded that Facebook give Black researchers, data scientists, and Black communities access to our data. It was just not enough for Facebook to make sure that this never happens again. We saw this as an opportunity for Facebook to use its data to defend the civil and human rights of everyone in this country and all over the world, especially those whose lives will never be the same because of the actions of the current administration. This launched an advocacy campaign that we took to Capitol Hill, which my colleague Max, the mastermind behind the Senate strategy, will dive deeper into. And our work continues. We know that big data is more than just a collection of technologies, a vast amount of information and different types of it. It is more than a revolution in measurement and prediction. It has become a philosophy, an ideological regime about how decisions will be made and who makes them. It has given legitimacy to a new form of social and political control that has taken the digital artifacts of our existence and found new ways to use them against us. And we believe that this is one of the most important civil rights issues of our time. Data for Black Lives is about how to harness the power of data to make real change in the lives of Black people. It is about developing the leadership of scientists and activists. And yes, it is about using the datafication of our society to make bold demands for racial justice. But at its core, Data for Black Lives is about life and protecting the sanctity of life. We are calling forth a new era, an era where data will be recognized as a tool for profound social change, a weapon to defend and protect in a time of incredible unrest in the streets, divisive culture wars in the media. It'll be used to connect and mobilize people to build a powerful, multiracial, multi-generational, interdisciplinary movement for the future. And we invite you all, students, faculty, and community members, to join us in this fight, to join us in this movement, to reclaim the role of data in the present and in the future, to reimagine data as protest, data as accountability, and data as collective action. Thank you.
Go for it. First and most important lesson, never follow Yeshi. Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it. Perfect. Thanks. And you can leave the lights where they are. The slides aren't super important. Hi. I'm really excited to be here. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. I'm honored to be part of this panel of folks that I already had sort of massive smart person crushes on. And I'm thrilled to be here with you all. Amazing that you made it out. I know the weather is getting worse and worse out there. So thank you for braving the snow and ice to be part of this important conversation. So I wrote this book called Automating Inequality, How High-Tech Tools Profile, Police, and Punish the Poor. It tells 3 stories about the way that new digital tools and automated decision-making tools are being used in public services across the United States. So I tell 3 stories in the book. I tell a story of an attempt to automate and modernize all of the eligibility systems for the public assistance system in the state of Indiana. I tell a story about an attempt to create a tool whose proponents call the Match.com of homeless services, a system called the Coordinated Entry System in Los Angeles, but actually really across the country and increasingly around the world. And the final story I tell is about a statistical model that's supposed to be able to predict which children might be victims of abuse or neglect sometime in the future in Allegheny County, which is the county in Pennsylvania where Pittsburgh is. And I'm going to pick up with sort of some of the things that Yeshi mentioned about what happens with these risk scores in what I talk about today. So I want to try to, while being very conscious of my time, I want to try to tell 4 very complicated stories in a very short amount of time. So I know we're going to get to 2. We might get to all 4. The first 2 are about something that folks call bias laundering. And the second 2 are about what I think of as the racial logic of what I describe in the book as the digital poorhouse, which is this invisible institution we're increasingly building to regulate the lives of poor and working class families in the United States through the kind of tools that I talk about in the book. One of the things that I think is really crucial to always acknowledge anytime I talk about the work that went into this book is this is my first book of investigative long-form journalism. I wrote as a scholar in the past. And as such, it was a book that required me to ask sources to go on the record. That is, to share their real names, their real places, their real experiences, to verify those with documents and by talking to other people. And in doing that, they gave us all an incredibly generous and courageous gift. So I want to recognize that the folks who shared their stories with me did so at incredible risk to themselves. These are folks who are relying on state or county programs for food, for housing, and to keep their families together, to not lose their children. So that they shared their stories is incredibly brave and incredibly generous. So I want to make sure that I share with you some of the stories of the people I spoke to when I was doing the reporting for this book. So rather than starting with the history of a system, I want to start with the history of a family. And I want to tell you about Angel and Patrick in Allegheny County. I met Angel Shepard and Patrick Grebe in a family support center in Duquesne, Pennsylvania, which is sort of a community hub where families who have been child welfare involved get together to sort of share resources, to do peer education, to connect with each other. And they didn't stand out right away because their experience really is so utterly average, so characteristic of the routine, mundane indignities that are experienced by the white working class. So they've struggled with low-wage, dangerous work, poor quality public schools and predatory online education, poor health and community violence. But through it all, they've remained really creative, involved, innovative parents. So I describe Patrick in the book as like a Buddhist ex-biker. He's this like rectangular man about as wide as this podium. He has very elaborate facial hair, and he's very calm. And Patrick and Angel are helping to raise 2 girls, Angel's daughter, Harriet, and Patrick's daughter's daughter, Desiree. The 2 girls are roughly the same age, and because they're so close in age, they fight a lot, they bicker a lot. And how Angel and Patrick have learned to deal with this is with a technique they call the get-along shirt. And the get-along shirt is one of Patrick's like enormous button-down Oxfords that they put both the girls in. One arm through one armhole of the shirt, one arm around the waist of the other girl, and then they button the shirt back up. And you're not allowed to leave the get-along shirt until you stop fighting, even if you have to go to the bathroom. So this is the thing that Patrick says always works. As soon as someone has to pee, they stop fighting, because no one wants to go to the bathroom in the get-along shirt. So despite this, Angel and Patrick have racked up really a lifetime of interactions with what in Pennsylvania is called Children, Youth, and Family Services, or CYF. In other places, that's called CPS or child welfare. So Patrick was investigated for medical neglect in the early 2000s because he brought his daughter to the emergency room. She was prescribed antibiotics. He couldn't afford to pay for the antibiotics. When she got worse, he brought her back to the emergency room. And the nurse who had seen them both times called Child Protective Services on him. When Harriet, Angel's daughter, was 5, someone phoned in a series of calls to the Child Abuse and Neglect Hotline. So this is an anonymous, it's possible to be anonymous when you call the child welfare tip line. And this anonymous caller explained that Harriet was running around the neighborhood unsupervised, that she was down the block teasing a dog, that she wasn't being properly clothed, fed, or bathed, that she wasn't getting needed medication. So for each call, an investigator came out to the house, interviewed Harriet and Tabitha, Angel and Patrick, looked in all the cupboards and under all the beds, and requested access to the family's medical records. Each time, they found there was no evidence of maltreatment, and they closed the case. But all of this information was put into their digital case file, their digital record, which is held in a data warehouse that the county built in 1999 that feeds this tool called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, which is a tool that's supposed to be able to risk rate families for how likely they are to abuse or neglect their children. So Patrick and Angel live in what they describe to me as this sort of state of low-grade everyday terror, where there might be another call on their family, and this algorithm will target their daughter or granddaughter for investigation and possibly for removal to foster care. So Angel told me, this is a quote, "You feel like a prisoner. You feel trapped. It's like no matter what you do, it's not good enough for them. My daughter's now 9, and I'm still afraid that they're gonna come up one day, see her out by herself, and say, you can't have her anymore." So I want to talk a little bit about the Allegheny Family Screening Tool so you understand where Angel and Patrick's concerns come from. And then I want to talk a little bit about bias laundering and specifically about how these tools are often rationalized by describing them as bias-removing tools, particularly in public services. So the Allegheny Family Screening Tool is built on top of this data warehouse that was created in 1999. As of the writing of the book, it held 1 billion records on families in Allegheny County, more than 800 for every individual in the county. But of course, it doesn't collect information equally on everybody. So Allegheny, the Department of Human Services in Allegheny County really only has access to data about people who reach out for help with their parenting to public resources, so county resources or state resources. So for example, if you are a poor and working class family and you're having trouble with addiction, you want help with recovery, or you're having mental health issues, you're gonna reach out to the county office of mental health or the county office of drug and alcohol. If you're a professional middle class family, you will likely reach out to a doctor. If you are, have a doctor that's paid for with employee covered insurance, private insurance, then your data is not going into this data warehouse. If you need help with respite care or you need help with publicly subsidized childcare, your data goes in the data warehouse. If you can afford a nanny or a babysitter, your data does not go in the warehouse. Now, this is a really huge issue around how the outlines or the structures of the database limit the kinds of things that this tool can recognize, and because it can recognize them, predict. So the parents I talked to in Allegheny County about this tool told me that they felt like the tool confuses parenting while poor with poor parenting. But it's a kind of poverty profiling that means that because the state can collect more data on them because they're asking for public assistance, that means that they are surveilled more often. Because they are surveilled more often, they are seen as riskier to their families. Because they are seen as riskier to their families, they're investigated more often. Because they're investigated more often, they're seen as riskier parents, right? And the system comes back around, creating what the families I talked to thought of as a feedback loop of injustice. So they're concerned with false positives problems, right? The system seeing harm where no harm actually might exist. Now, what's really interesting and how this gets into this larger point about bias laundering is the frontline caseworkers of the child welfare system actually share this concern, but for different reasons. So they also are really concerned about the limitations of the data set, but they're concerned about them because they're afraid that the system, since it only has, because it does not collect information on wealthy white families, can't see the kinds of harms that happen in those families, and then can't recognize or predict that kind of harm. And I just want to introduce you to one of the caseworkers as well. So this is Pat Gordon. And I write about Pat. Pat Gordon's the kind of woman who keeps pictures of other people's children in her cubicle. A Pittsburgh native in a Pirates van, when I met her, she wore a telephone headset, pushing back her ear-length bob, and would only tell me that she was, quote, over 40. 6 lines were busy on her phone when she stood to greet me that day. She wore a long-sleeve pink t-shirt that complemented her warm brown skin, and she had a mischievous laugh that transitioned to quiet seriousness when we talked about the kids that she serves. So I mentioned to Pat that I've been talking to parents in the CYF system about how the Allegheny Family Screening Tool might impact them. And most parents, I told her, are concerned about false positives, this idea that the model rating their child at a high risk of abuse or neglect when little risk actually exists. But Pat reminded me that I should also be concerned with false negatives. When the Allegheny Family Screening Tool scores a child at low risk, though the allegation in the report or the phone call might be serious. So Allegheny County has this extraordinary amount of information about the use of public programs stored in their data warehouse. But the county has no access to data about people who don't use public services. So for example, geographic isolation, there's some really good evidence that geographic isolation is highly correlated with abuse and neglect. But families who live in isolated neighborhoods will not be represented in the system because these are not the people who are accessing public services. So I asked Pat if she was concerned with the cases where a family lives in the suburbs, for example, and no one's ever called on them before, or a caregiver is accessing private services for mental health or addiction, so they're not in the system. And she said to me, exactly. I wonder if people downtown really get that. I mean, we're not looking for this to do our job. We're really not. I hope they get that. So Pat was one of the most thoughtful and brilliant people that I spoke to in the sort of 105 interviews that I did for this book. There's a really troubling history of racial discrimination in every child welfare system in the country. So in 47 states, African-American children are disproportionately represented among the foster care population based on their proportion in the general population. It's a problem that's known as racial disproportionality. And that's true in Allegheny County, just like it's true everywhere else. So as of the writing of the book, 38% of children in the foster care system in Allegheny County were Black or biracial, though Black and biracial youth only made up 18% of the youth population. So they're about 2 times more likely to be in foster care than they should. But the designers of this system talked to me about this tool as removing biased discretion, biased decision-making in the front line of the child welfare system. And the front line is folks like Pat Gordon. They're the folks who work in what's known as the intake call screening center, who receive these calls from the county hotline or receive reports from mandated reporters about suspected abuse or neglect. And they make a really difficult decision. They decide which families to screen in for a fuller investigation and which families to screen out. So the designers of this system told me that one of the things they hope to be able to do with it was to identify patterns of discriminatory decision-making in the front line in that intake call center to be able to start to address racial disproportionality in Allegheny County. The trick here is that discretion is not actually being removed from these systems. It's just being moved from one group of people to another group of people. So I have a really smart political science friend named Joe Sauce, and Joe says discretion is like energy. It's never created or destroyed. It's only ever moved. So the question is not, are we removing discrimination and bias from these systems? The question is, who are we taking it from and who are we giving it to? And what I want people to consider is that the people whose discretion is being questioned and limited are actually the most diverse part of the social service workforce. They're the most racially diverse, they're the most working class, and they're most female part of the workforce, people like Pat Gordon. They're also closest to the problems they're trying to stop. And we're giving that power to academic economists, data scientists, and social scientists who are often on international teams and are far away from the people their tools are actually affecting. So the problem, one of the problems with these systems is that they only understand bias as individual, disordered, irrational thinking. But of course, bias is systemic and structural. So it's what Oscar Gandy calls rational discrimination. So for example, this tool is aimed explicitly at the screening process. But the county's own data shows that discrimination is not entering this system at the point of screening. It's actually entering at the point of referral, which means that Black and biracial families are 3.5 times more likely to be called on by the community for abuse or neglect. Once they're in the system, screening actually adds a tiny little bit of disproportionality to that. So screeners screen in 69% of Black and biracial youth and only 65% of white families. But the problem here is not screening bias, it's referral bias. And so one of the things I want us to really think about is why are we then pointing our most sophisticated tools where the problem is not? And I would argue that we're doing it because the kinds of problems that referral bias point to are large structural cultural problems. And they're not necessarily amenable to database solutions. So that problem, that referral problem, is because we as a culture believe we think we know what a safe family looks like. And that family is white and rich. That is not a problem that will be solved by the Allegheny Family Screening Tool. And in fact, removing discretion from this very diverse front line of public workers, unionized public workers, by the way, may very well remove a block to the intensification and the automation of bias in these systems. So this is what's called bias laundering, what some people have called bias laundering. So don't think of it as like washing clothes. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about laundering like money laundering, that is transforming illegally obtained profits into ostensibly legitimate assets by passing them through a system that's perceived as clean. That's what money laundering is. And I want us to understand database bias laundering in the same way. So when we talk about bias laundering, we tend to talk about just ignoring the biases in these systems. So Francois Cholet, for example, from Google's machine learning and AI group, tweeted after this kerfuffle around AOC's statement about racist algorithms that, quote, bias laundering happens when we choose to ignore the biases of automated decision systems because of the illusion that all algorithms must be objective since they're driven by math. But in Allegheny County, we see bias laundering truly at work. And it's much deeper than just this kind of math washing, of pretending that data is neutral. So the data set, if we go back, the data set is deeply, tragically unjust, is a form of poverty profiling. The administrative design of the system, removes discretion from those closest to problems, so the most diverse, most working class, most female part of the workforce. And I believe it's a very sophisticated tool aimed at the place that the problem's not happening, which is really a way of shifting attention away from the very real structural problems we have with racial and economic inequity in this country. So we have to remember that all tools, including digital tools, are built to solve political problems. And in this case, it's built to address the bias of individuals as a irrational thought process without addressing the underlying structural racism and classism that produces unjust outcomes. I have so many other things to say and only 3 minutes left. Do we have time to talk about eugenics, or should I save it for question and answers? I don't have time to talk about eugenics, darn it. So important, history, learn your history. Yeah, so skipping forward. You know what I'm going to do is cede my time to the next person because I think I'm excited to get to the conversation where we start to push on these ideas a little bit. But one of the things that I'll just sort of point up as something I want to talk about as we get into that conversation is how the racial logic of these systems continues to operate, even when the systems are primarily pointed at poor white people, as they were in Indiana. And actually, that's part of a larger racial strategy where government rolls out these systems first to poor white communities with the hopefully mistaken belief that they won't stand up, and then roll them out to communities of color afterwards in order to create racial tension around these tools. And so I really want us to talk about that in some depth, but I know I can't do it justice in 2 minutes. So we're just going to put a pin in that, and we're going to come back to that in a minute. Thank you so much for your attention and for being here for the conversation.
All right. So I'm going to tell a story about how I got into this work and how we can effectively use data to advance racial justice. So my story begins on August 9th, 2014, which is the day Mike Brown was shot and killed in the streets of Ferguson, Missouri. His death sparked a national protest movement that has reverberated to this day and helped change the conversation about race and racism in society. But you'll recall that in the early days and weeks and months of that movement, as communities and activists took to the streets demanding accountability for police violence, particularly against Black people, what we heard from researchers and academics and police chiefs across the country was skepticism that there was an issue at all. They would say things like, well, we don't know for sure whether there's racial bias in police shootings because we don't have the data. And without the data, we're not ready to do anything about this issue. Despite the lived experiences of so many people who had experienced this for generations in their communities, they were dismissed because they did not have the data to validate their own lives. Now, the reason that the data didn't exist was no fault of their own. The reason the data doesn't exist is because the federal government, even to this day, does not collect comprehensive data on people killed by police, let alone all of the other forms of police violence that are much more frequent in society. And that's a methodological issue. They rely on each of the 18,000 police departments across the country to submit consistent and reliable data every single year with no enforcement mechanism. And so you get a reality where in the federal database, it says that nobody has been killed by police in Florida for the past decade. And we know that's not true. A simple Google search will prove otherwise. So at that time, I connected with activists on the ground in Ferguson, and together we did what the federal government would not. We used information from crowdsourced databases like Fatal Encounters and Killed by Police, information from media reports and from official records, from public records requests to police departments, to build the most comprehensive database in the United States at mapping police violence. And we started really with this map. I know it's kind of hard to see in this lighting, but this is a map of black people killed by police in 2014. We found that over 300 black people were killed by police that year. 1,200 people are killed by police every single year in this country, 3 to 4 people every single day. And as you can see with the map, that this wasn't a problem limited to any one city or any one region. This was happening all across the country. So I'm going to do a little overview of some of the data that we collected and what it told us about the scale of police violence in this country and how it impacts black communities in particular. We learned that in 97% of all cases where a police officer kills a civilian in this country, no officers are charged with a crime. In 99% of all cases, no officers are convicted of a crime. And in fact, when officers are convicted and sentenced, they receive a lesser sentence than civilians convicted of the same crimes. So there's a case in Georgia, which is one of the only police officers that has been charged and convicted and sentenced for killing a civilian, killed an unarmed black man in Georgia. And the judge, for the first time in Georgia's history, gave this police officer a sentence allowing him to serve prison time only on the weekends. So we got a part-time prison sentence. And in that decision, the judge explicitly said that was because he was a police officer. So there's no accountability. Functionally, there's no accountability for police violence in the United States. We wanted to also understand how police violence impacts particular communities. So we disaggregated that data by race, right? And it's important to note that this data would not be possible to collect if we were relying on institutions to collect it for us. The federal government still hasn't collected this data, although they've decided to start adopting our methodology to collect it in the near future, hopefully. We did this by crowdsourcing this. We did this by relying on what we could find online, relying on local media reports, using the tools at our disposal to collect the data in a different way. And what we found were that black people were 3 times more likely to be killed by police than their white peers. Latinos were about 1.5 times more likely, also more likely to be unarmed when killed by police. And again, this is an underestimate because oftentimes we're still constrained, even though we're not depending on the police to give us the data. The media narratives, in many cases, depend on the police narrative to inform their data. And so this is most likely an underestimate. So data can help us understand the scale of an issue and how it impacts particular communities. It can also be a tool for holding institutions accountable to addressing those issues. And to do that, it requires breaking down and disaggregating that data at the institutional level. So for each police agency in the country, for the 100 largest cities in the country, we just aggregated this data. So these are the rates of police violence per population for the 100 largest cities. And this is actually at mappingpoliceviolence.org. You can scroll down for the full 100. But what we found was that the rate of police violence varies dramatically depending on where you are. So there were some cities where police were killing people at extraordinary rates, places like St. Louis, where a black man is twice as likely to be killed by police as the average American is to be killed by police or civilians, twice as high as the US murder rate. Orlando, Florida, where I'm from, second highest rate of police violence. Oklahoma City, 1 in 6 homicides are committed by police. And then at the low end of the spectrum, there were actually cities where police were not killing people. There were cities like Irvine, California. There were cities like Buffalo, New York that had comparatively lower rates of police violence, something that posed additional questions of what might be happening behind the scenes there that we could learn from and scale. Now, on this side of the chart, you can see this is a chart of people killed by police between 2013 and 2017, coded by race. These are unarmed people killed by police specifically. So what you can see here, the red are black people killed by police, the orange are Latinos killed by police, and the gray are white people killed by police. What this means is that almost every unarmed person killed by a police officer in a major American city is a person of color, and the majority are black. So this data tells a story about what's happening. So those are the facts about police violence, but how do we use this information? How do we use these data to impact the narratives that have sought to justify and sustain and reproduce police violence in our communities? So the first narrative is about crime, and I'm just going to do a quick poll. By show of hands, how many people have heard some version of this narrative? And the narrative goes like this: that police are using deadly force because they are in violent and dangerous communities, and they need to use deadly force to defend themselves or others from harm. How many, by show of hands, have heard some variation of this narrative? It's ubiquitous, ubiquitous. Now, you'll notice that there's no data that's really provided to support those narratives. Those are narratives that have been around for centuries. And in collecting the data, we're actually able to test some of these narratives. So we looked at, for example, rates of violent crime in US cities, represented by the blue X's, and rates of police violence in US cities. There's 60 largest cities in the country, represented by the red squares. What you can see here is there's not a correlation. That there are cities with very high rates of violent crime that have very low rates of police violence, and cities with very high rates of police violence that have low rates of violent crime. Something else is explaining why police are being violent, and it has nothing to do with the violence in communities. For example, Buffalo, New York, and Orlando, Florida. So between 2013 and 2016, these two cities had similar sized populations, similar demographics, similar violent crime rates. Buffalo had a little bit higher violent crime rate. 0 people were killed by police in Buffalo during that time period, and 15 people were killed by police in Orlando, Florida. So what is happening in Orlando, Florida that needs to be urgently addressed? And what is happening in Buffalo, New York that we might be able to learn from and scale? Those are the types of questions that we could then start to answer. Using data to identify solutions. So we took the data on the outcomes in terms of police violence. We took the data on the inputs in terms of demographics of communities, in terms of the policies and practices of each of those jurisdictions. And we conducted an analysis to identify what are those factors that are associated with significantly lower rates of police violence in US cities. And visualize those factors in this easy to understand 10-point policy proposal called Campaign Zero. So I'm going to dive into how we use data to identify solutions using one of these 10 categories, and that is category number 3, limit use of force. So, use of force. Each police department in this country, except for some of the small police departments which don't actually have any policies, fun fact, most police departments have a use of force policy. This is a policy that articulates how and when police officers are authorized to use force, what level of force they're authorized to use in what situation, and what are the consequences in terms of discipline that happen if they violate those policies. So through public records requests, we obtained the use of force policies of the 100 largest police departments in the country. And working with legal experts and activists and researchers and volunteers across the country, we reviewed each of those policies to identify the extent to which they were either restrictive or less restrictive on police use of force. And here's an example of that. This is San Jose, California, city of about 1 million people. And this is their use of force policy. And it states, and I quote, "Officers need not retreat or desist in the reasonable use of force. There is no requirement that officers use a lesser intrusive force option before progressing to a more intrusive force option." That's the public policy of that police department. Contrast that with Philadelphia. "It is important for first responding officers to use caution, evaluate the situation, attempt to de-escalate the situation through communication, request a crisis intervention team trained officer, wait for backup, and await the arrival of a patrol supervisor before taking any action, barring a threat to life. Retreating or repositioning is not a sign of weakness or cowardice by an officer. It is often a tactically superior police procedure rather than the immediate use of force. The primary duty of all police officers is to preserve human life. Only the minimal amount of force necessary to protect life or effect an arrest should be used by an officer." I'm just going to go to the bottom here. "The application of deadly force is a measure to be employed only in the most extreme circumstances after all lesser means of force have failed or could not be reasonably employed." This is literally the opposite policy of San Jose. San Jose, no requirement for officers to use a lesser intrusive force option before progressing to a more intrusive one. And Philadelphia very much requires that. So the question is, looking through these policies, identifying these sentences and provisions within them, do these things actually matter? Are these just words on a piece of paper, or do these actually impact and relate to the rates of police violence in those jurisdictions? And to answer that, we conducted an analysis where we were able to identify 8 types of policies that impose restrictions on police use of force across these different departments that we reviewed. Things like, does the department require de-escalation whenever possible? Does the department have a continuum of force, which articulates, for example, the types of force that can be used in particular situations? So if somebody's sitting on the ground and refusing to get up, you're not allowed to tase that person, for example. Does the department ban chokeholds and strangleholds? Does it require officers to give a verbal warning before shooting somebody? Does it restrict shooting at moving vehicles? Does it require officers to exhaust all other means before shooting somebody? So for example, requiring a taser and lesser force before deadly force. Does it require officers to intervene if they witness another officer using excessive force? And does it require officers to report every time they use force? So we reviewed all of these policies of the 100 departments, visualized this in this grid at useofforceproject.org so you can see for your city which policies it has, which it doesn't. This is interactive. And what's interesting is it turns out that each of these policies is associated with significantly fewer killings by police for those departments that have adopted them. So much so that departments that require de-escalation, for example, were 15% less likely to kill civilians. Departments that require officers to exhaust all other means before shooting were 25% less likely to kill civilians. And departments that had multiple of these policies in place were those that were least likely to be violent. So much so that when you control for things like the demographics of a community, the size of the police force, crime rates, and a range of different factors, adopting all 8 of those policies was associated with a 72% reduction in killings by police compared to departments that adopted 0 of those policies. Significantly fewer killings by police. So back to narratives. So whenever you try to implement a policy that seeks to hold the police accountable or increase the level of oversight and restrictions on how and when police use force, you get a similar pushback from police unions and police chiefs seeking to prevent that from happening. And the narrative goes something like this. If you impose this type of restriction, these policies that I spoke of, that it will handcuff police officers and prevent them from defending themselves or others from harm. You'll also notice that the police unions will never, ever present any data validating that that's true. It's just sort of taken as fact by the media, by public policymakers, and that becomes a narrative that we all sort of seek to, that we all understand and becomes ubiquitous, sort of like this good guy with a gun narrative that the NRA has, that everybody knows about, has this power, but yet has no data behind it. Well, we tested that as well, right? So another way that you can use data is to actively seek to anticipate and debunk some of those narratives that you know are about to be raised by the opposition. Turns out that those police departments that had the most restrictive use of force policies also were the safest for officers. They had the fewest assaults on officers. Officers were no more likely to be injured during an assault. And they had the same crime rates as jurisdictions that had the least restrictive use of force policies. So having this data has been essential in conversations with police chiefs and other policymakers to actually passing policies that have imposed these types of restrictions. So that's sort of the basic level work. Now we can get a little bit more advanced because we're able to collect more and better data. So this is an analysis from the Invisible Institute, which is sort of a gold standard in terms of analyzing at a police department level what's going on in terms of the spread of police misconduct. So they were able to obtain data on 30,000 police officers at the Chicago Police Department, data going back 17 years on every use of force, every civilian complaint against police officers, and every misconduct lawsuit against a police officer. And what they were able to find was not only was there a smaller group of officers within that police department that had much higher rates of police violence and use of force. About 1,300 of those 30,000 officers had far higher rates of use of force. But that those officers were never held accountable. And as time progressed, as new officers, new recruits were put under the supervision of those officers, were put on the same patrols of those officers, were put in contact with those officers also began exhibiting higher rates of use of force. So what you see here visualized is the spread of police misconduct through a police department like a disease, where it starts relatively limited, and by the end of those 17 years, because there's no accountability structure to intervene early and root out these police officers, you end up with an entire police department that is rife with misconduct, and that is the Chicago Police Department. So this allows us to think differently about interventions. You think about this from a public health perspective. Now we can diagnose and intervene in a different way. So, using data to advance systemic change. So we've taken this data and this research. We have spoken with policymakers, met with Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton in the 2016 campaign and informed their policing agendas, met with President Obama, informed his task force report on policing, and other local and state policymakers, but we're one team, right? And we shouldn't be in every room. We can't be in every room. There are 18,000 jurisdictions across the country. And so our task as researchers and data scientists is how do we make this information accessible so that anybody can take it and use it, can not only understand the research, understand the data, but use that to advocate for the solutions within their own jurisdictions without having to go through us as sort of middlemen. And so one way that we're able to do this is by creating this basic survey, which asks people what type of work did they want to do? Did they want to help find police department policies, review those policies, collect data on police violence, advocate and meet with representatives around that? We asked them what work they wanted to do, what their background was, how many hours a week they had to contribute, and where they were located. We had 18,000 volunteers sign up in 2 weeks to get involved using this, which on the back end was sort of a nightmare because we had this massive CSV file with 18,000 rows and I think it was like 20 columns. So had to manually process all of that, invite people into Slack groups. Those were actually the volunteers that built all of what I've presented. They collected the data, they reviewed the policies. We had designers and developers who signed up that built the websites and the interactive visualizations. This was a collaborative project, and because of that methodology, what we were able to do was not only have sort of one team that knew the research, but we had people in each of these jurisdictions that had read their police department's policy, that had reviewed it, that could then meet with their policymakers. We had scaled advocacy and activism and built people's capacity to be part of the change. Movement building. Another way we're able to do this is by simplifying the process of contacting your representatives using a range of different data sets. So we had volunteers tracking every policy that was proposed in every state legislature across the country having to deal with policing. We integrated that into this widget, which allows you to put in your zip code, find your state representatives, see what their votes have been on those bills, and then contact them all in 3 clicks or less. By making this process as easy as possible, because without this, you would have to go through legislative databases, you'd have to review all of these bills, find the bills, read the bills, like nobody was gonna do that. By making this process easier, we had 100,000 people use this tool to contact their representatives. And we're also able to incorporate now aspects of machine learning. So now that we've reviewed hundreds of police departments' policy manuals, we know the type of language to look for. We can train a machine to look for that language and code the extent to which those best practices are currently in place. And so right now we're working on a tool that will allow just that, where you upload the document and it'll spit out exactly the extent to which your police department's policy manual conforms to those best practices. So this is scalable across all 18,000 jurisdictions in the country. So progress. Since 2014, the majority of US states have enacted some piece of legislation related to police reform. This sounds good, it's not. Oftentimes, this is just one law that, for example, requires better data collection, which is interesting, but again, we already have a lot of data. It's time for action. There are some states, however, that have gone further. Places like Connecticut, which has enacted a officer misconduct database, prohibited officers who've been fired for misconduct from being rehired, created a better data collection system, implemented independent investigations and prosecutions of police killings, and a range of other best practices. And now that we track the data not only on the policies that are being adopted, but also on the outcomes in terms of police violence, we're able to see the benefits of those solutions being enacted. And so what you find is that in cities that have adopted new use of force policies that impose greater restrictions on police use of force, they have significantly fewer police shootings the year after implementation. So these are lives saved as a direct consequence of policies being adopted. But that's just the beginning. According to Pew Research surveys, there are 104 million Americans who currently support the Black Lives Matter movement. 104 million. There were 63 million Americans that voted for Hillary Clinton, 60 million Americans that voted for Donald Trump, 104 million people who support the Black Lives Matter movement. But at best, only a tiny fraction of that many people are actively involved in the work. If we're serious about transformational change, in order to get there, it requires creating systems and structures and algorithms and tools and organizing strategies that can effectively onboard and engage and create pathways for 104 million people to get involved in this work. When we do that, we will achieve transformational change. That is not only a technological problem, that is an infrastructural and organizing problem, but I believe that some of the methodologies that we have used to get to a smaller scale of this can be implemented at a broader scale over time and are just the beginning of what's possible. So with that, I'm done. Here are some resources you can go to, and I'm looking forward to the questions part of this.
Connor's gonna save the day. Get my slides up. Sure. Just gotta squeeze out. Great, and I use this, right? Cool. So I'm Max. Oh my God, my goddaughter's in the back. My new goddaughter, a Brown classmate, Zuri. Everyone say hi to Zuri. And so I'm gonna be a little bit reflective in the beginning because it's kind of special to be back at Brown. So first off, I just want to shout out Yeshi. I'm turning 30 in a couple months, and it's the time where you start to be reflective about your life and where it's taken you. And I have to tell you, I've been a lot of different places, worked with a lot of different people, but nothing really gets me excited to be really at the front lines of what I think and how Yeshi frames one of the sort of important civil rights battles of our time. And so it's really exciting. And I think the great thing is that a lot of this stuff started here. I think Yeshi, Lucas, and I obviously had a lot in common around social causes and what we cared about here, but we also spent a lot of time thinking about how to plan parties. And so Yeshi had an apartment off campus, and although I don't look like it, I was one of the bouncers. And Lucas was like a runner. He did whatever, and he's a mathematician now. But so that's that. So Yeshi kind of framed the vision for Data for Black Lives and the way we approach our work. Yeshi gave me power to think about, hey, Max, let's use your experience in the political world. I'm on a sabbatical from the political stuff now, but to think about how can you apply policy advocacy principles and work and expertise to the movement. So our approach, and I can't have Trisha Rose in the crowd without having a reference to hip hop. So data rules everything around me, but also this is kind of our approach to how we think about policy and advocacy, because we leave no stone unturned. And I think a lot of people think that I'm like some glorified lobbyist or I spend a lot of time in DC, but as you'll see in a little bit, we think about policy a little bit differently. So here's like the five kind of ways we think about policy. So there's been a lot of talk here about narrative. And narrative is huge. And I think we focus not just the stories that are told, but who tells it. Because we have, one of the things we've noticed, and one of the reasons why we convene folks in a conference and we do a lot of regional gatherings is, I think that who's telling the stories matters as much as the kinds of stories that are being told. Second thing we think about, and I'm gonna have to disagree with Sam, who says that we can't be in every room. So Yeshi, Lucas, and I can't be in every room, but we know somebody who can, and part of the work we need to do is make sure we identify those rooms and identify the people who should be in there having the conversations, which relates to the third thing about who counts as an expert, right? And I think in many cases, I spent a lot of time thinking about how to get folks who are our fellow panelists in front of policymakers and decision makers. And we don't think of decision makers as just folks in DC who are working on policy or public officials, but even the hospital CEO or higher education professionals. Number four, there's a lot of kind of conversation, especially on the Hill or in policy space, around oversight. But we think before you get to oversight, you really have to have proximity and insight. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about how do we get proximity, how do we make sure people really get deep into learning about the issues that matter to the communities we represent. And our last point is really thinking about capacity building and leadership development. I'll walk through examples for all these as we go. So on narrative. So Yeshi wrote an open letter to Facebook, and she could talk a little bit more about this in Q&A, but I think we were kind of concerned about, right after the Facebook Cambridge Analytica stuff came out, we were kind of concerned about all the conversations around like privacy, which is important, but we know that the Facebook breach or when we found out about all the data being released, we knew it impacted communities of people in a different way. And we wanted to figure out a way to tell that story, but we also wanted to think about solutions in a different way too. And so this open letter never sort of asked for permission. I think the great thing about having a public platform like Medium is just put your ideas out there and push it out. And this went viral because not only was it just very grassrootsy, put it out there and push it out, but a lot of people started to resonate and wanted something different, because I think all the conversations around the Facebook stuff was kind of the same. And in that letter, we kind of made 3 public demands. One, and we can go into this in the Q&A, was we know that Facebook collects a lot of data, and Yeshi used to always tell the story of going to research.facebook.com and seeing how data is used to understand natural disasters, to understand things around housing and prices. And so there's potential and opportunity for data to be used for good if it's in the hands of the right people. And so one of the ideas that's been advanced with the open letter is like working with Facebook to commit anonymized data to a public data trust. And there's like a lot of energy and excitement around thinking about what that looks like. And we invite a lot of people now to help us think about the framework for that. The second is thinking about working with advocates, technologists, to establish a data code of ethics. I think we think a lot about kind of like the institutional review board, but also just accountability and transparency about when data is used, who's using it, understanding like how do you hold people accountable after they have access to the data, making sure they're using it for the intended kind of purposes. And then 3, we think it's very important to think about hiring Black data scientists and research scientists who understand how to think about the issues that the Data for Black Lives movement kind of centers. And the other thing we think about is we go wherever decision makers are. And this is very grassrootsy, and a lot of our policy work is just driven by our work as organizers. And for those who are studying public policy here, some of this might not resonate with like the policy memos you do or the implementation and all that stuff, but believe me, this works. And so one of the things we decided to do, our hometown kind of senator is Ed Markey, and he's on the, so right after the Facebook stuff broke, Yeshi's demand was, hey, let's get this out there. And so I thought about, hey, there are a lot of hearings that are going to be happening with a lot of these tech CEOs. What's a way to be a part of the process? And the strategy was, there's a lot of, this is with a Senate hearing or a House hearing, it's all about the questions. And the people who come up with the questions are the staffers. And so it's not about emailing, writing all these, I mean, emailing is great and making calls is great, but building relationships with staffers on these committees, understanding where people sit, and the 2 committees that really intersect with data for our purposes, especially around the Facebook stuff, was the Commerce on the Senate side and also the Judiciary. And so we spent a lot of time, I called it hashtag Senate strategy, where we just went on the Hill and met with senators and told them a little bit about how the narratives and the story, and lifted up the stories of people that are impacted by data in a whole different way. And we spent a lot of time working with staffers from Senator Cory Booker's office, for example, thinking about and framing the questions that he would ask during interviews like this. And kind of an example of like putting your ideas out there, building kind of public support, Booker decided to endorse our demands in a public way, and literally took our open letter and decided to try to advance that cause and work directly with Facebook to enact broader reforms around diversity, public data trust, and ethics, which was basically the foundation of our open letter. So that's really an impact of that work. And related to that, I think with all the different the great thing about, I said data rules everything around me, as a one way I think about every single day, you hear about facial recognition, predictive policing, some technology is kind of exposed on a daily basis, and part of what we like to do is raise a lot of public education and awareness about not only what these technologies do, but who they impact. And so we spent some time also going across the way to the House, thinking about there are some folks, we also go to the people who this will naturally resonate with them kind of early on without too much convincing. And so we kind of identify the people, the decision makers who this naturally resonates with, or who have a passion for it, and then we start there and then kind of zoom out. But Ro Khanna, who represents kind of Silicon Valley, was tasked with thinking about an Internet Bill of Rights. And we were kind of if you notice, all the groups that were advising on this project were kind of the most different, right? But it was also, and what was interesting is, although we were around the table, I mean, I think a lot of the things the reason why this engagement has to be ongoing is because these Bill of Rights are great, but if the narratives and the stories about how this stuff impacts real people doesn't surface, then we don't know how this kind of thing can help, really address the root causes of the issues. The other thing we do, we're not kind of part of the delete Facebook movement or, not use Airbnb. We actually think about working directly with these companies. And in many cases, we've been invited to be part of their civil rights audits. And so Facebook is kind of slow walking, but they're thinking a lot about voter suppression, diversity, inclusion, transparency, fairness, and have some great people thinking about it. But I think with them, as much as they want to commit to this, they also just have the new thing happening, the new expose that makes it difficult to commit to this. But I think this is a start, and I think they have the right kind of people around the table. But it's not just about sitting a commission or sitting people on a committee. It's really thinking about how do you integrate these people and really get them to work directly with your teams. I think a good kind of model of where civil rights audits can actually implement something pretty interesting is Airbnb, which kind of became public about their challenges around discrimination and decided one of the interesting things they needed to do is develop a whole new anti-discrimination product team that was interdisciplinary, people from different teams. And so that's a model of like how an audit can lead to actually impactful things. And they've been actually thinking about some very interesting things about last names and photos, even the language that people use on the app, and thinking about where discrimination and bias can be introduced, and thinking about how do you build the tools to prevent that from happening. And so DC and tech companies are all good and all, but we get a lot of life from like really partnering with a lot of folks like the ACLU in Massachusetts and California, and AI Now Institute and a lot of organizations that Meredith lifted up earlier that are working on this stuff in a very local context. And so Cambridge, which is where we're based, just passed an ordinance that's regulating surveillance technology use by the city and the police department. New York City kind of became one of the first municipalities to think about automated decision systems and sit a task force that's also slow walking, but at least they're seated. But a task force that's really supposed to look at or help the different city agencies where automated decision systems might be introduced and help think about what are the decisions that are automated and how do you think about transparency and accountability. I think when it first started, the idea was to figure out how to publish all the source codes, but then the proprietary stuff and privacy stuff started creeping in. So now you have a task force, and now there's going to be a lot more transparency. But I think it's going from transparency to real change is going to be interesting. Face surveillance, a lot of folks are thinking about not only with respect to ICE and stuff on the border, but technologies, how police departments, local police departments are using face surveillance. And an example of, I think a lot of times our policy work is actually not the most fancy kind of DC-based work. I think in many cases we have a lot of people, and this is a story of Ramsey County, kind of Twin Cities, where people kind of raise their hand and say, hey, Data for Black Lives, we're a group of parents or students or teachers who like something doesn't smell right with the introduction of a technology. And we need your help in thinking about how we organize and push back. And this specific group reached out to us and said, well, here's what was going on here. And this is there was a joint powers agreement that was happening where the prosecutor's office, the Department of Education, the Public Health Department, we're thinking about, hey, we want to figure out how to flag kids who are coming from different contexts who might, at some point in the future, be criminal justice involved. And we want to create this joint powers agreement to share data across these different agencies and then share it with like a research institute to figure out how you can tag and flag these kids and then give them the kind of support they need before they get into the criminal justice system. But there were a lot of questions that were unanswered about. And part of what we help these folks do is ask questions, right? Who owns the data? Who pays for it? What's the public benefit? What are the ethics? And that conversation, them kind of being equipped with that language and pushing back and asking the public officials these questions kind of got them a victory recently, where the county has decided to retreat and now engage in a community engagement process around thinking about how to do this a little bit better. But I think this is an example of folks in the community just organizing amongst themselves, raising their hand and say, hey, we need a little bit of help building our capacity, learning more about the technology, and really equipping them with the language and the tools and the skills to kind of fight for their own causes. And we're happy to partner with folks like this just as much as we're happy to partner with folks at the federal level. But this is the kind of stuff that we're most excited about. Another Community One Big Data Zero is a group in New York City called Integrate New York City, which kind of takes kids who are in kind of segregated schools and helps organize them, youth. And their kind of big campaign is around Still Not Equal. And I think they raise their hands and say, hey, Data for Black Lives, we want to think about the school system and how unequal it is. And there's an algorithm that's being used, and we just need a couple software engineers to help us build an alternative algorithm. And who are the software engineers in New York City who can help plug us in? And so that's kind of one of the relationships and collaborations we help forge. The other thing we spend a lot of time doing is who counts as an expert? This is a photo from one of our recent Data for Black Lives conferences. What do you notice about the people who are experts on data and technology and racial justice? All African-American women. At MIT, they had a similar conversation, and this is what their speakers look like. And someone actually emailed me this and said, hey, Max, we met a long time ago, but I just wanted to show you why your work is important. Because you could get this or you could get this, depending on who you count or who you identify as being an expert on these issues. I think these are some of the top people talking about technology and racial justice in the whole country, and we find a way to make sure they're lifted up as experts on these issues. These are some other experts sitting around the table working on this. These are not the experts you hear about in mainstream. These are not the experts. These are people really working on the ground and in technology companies and at institutions, really trying to push. Another part of our policy work related to who counts as an expert, and I think the commission that sat in New York is great, but a lot of times we are grateful for our partners like ACLU and others who are working on this, but even they can be a little bit misguided. For example, here's a bill that's currently about to make moves in the Massachusetts State Legislature about setting up a commission. And this is a commission of people who are going to look at AI in government decision-making. What do you notice who's missing? That's the other question we ask a lot in this. Who's missing? So you have, because they think experts are just people at Harvard or MIT. Not Roxbury Community College, not Bunker Hill Community College, and not many of the organizers and activists we've been able to bring together in Massachusetts around these issues. And so a lot of times we have to push a lot of well-intended organizations in the space about, hey, who's missing? What are the biases you have about who counts as an expert? Related to insights or oversight, again, we spent a lot of time really thinking about bringing staffers together, bringing folks who kind of work behind the scenes and educating them and giving them insight. We spent a lot of time not just saying, hey, what is an algorithm, like at a basic level, but how is this stuff being used in the municipalities and places you represent? And I think we're also at a time where a lot of people like AOC are using their platform to talk about how algorithms are racist and really trying to build up a public consciousness around these issues. And the last thing we spend a lot of time doing is capacity building and leadership development. I think a lot of folks in our network have said that, hey, if they're an organizer, they want to learn more about data visualization, the legislative process, the formal, they want to learn about systems thinking. And if they're a technologist, they're technologists who want to learn more about public records requests and movement building and organizing. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about our network of 4,000 people and equipping them with the skills to be policymakers and influence the policymaking process. So I think I'm right on time. There you go.